Hi, I'm Nima Bassiri. Thank you for taking the time to look at my recent book, Madness and Enterprise, Psychiatry, Economic Reason, and the Emergence of Pathological Value, which came out with the University of Chicago Press at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year. The book offers a historical and philosophical discussion of the relationship between psychiatric medicine and economic thought during the 19th century and early 20th century, with a specific focus on Europe and the United States. It essentially argues that psychiatrists across Europe and North America encountered something like a diagnostic dilemma over the course of the 19th century with respect to ambiguous states of mental pathology. So these are behavioral abnormalities that were neither clearly healthy nor unhealthy. And in order to resolve them, they had to tacitly supplement their diagnostic assessments with economic appraisals of patients' everyday conduct. So determining whether a patient was good with money, whether they could manage their wealth, whether otherwise abnormal behaviors were nevertheless lucrative or not, all these various assessments could offset and even redeem suspicions of madness. I refer to this as an economic style of psychiatric reasoning, and through this economic style of reasoning, which eventually came to suffuse much of North Atlantic psychiatric thought by the start of the 20th century, through this style, prominent psychiatrists either implied or else very explicitly resolved that successful economic behaviors could counteract apparent pathological states. In fact, the economic style of psychiatric reasoning also led to this very peculiar medical conclusion that some of the severest mental pathologies and neuropathologies could in fact be compatible with economic activity, and that in some cases, madness could even be beneficial to economic success. So this economic style of psychiatric reasoning, in other words, produced what I argue was a very crucial, though inadvertent effect with respect to the presumed relationship between rationality and health and economic success. And what I mean was that it was actually not sanity or mental health, but rather madness that came to be most explicitly linked to economic value. This madness was essentially a medical condition that was measured largely on the basis of its economic output. So madness was not, in other words, a kind of dangerous threat to be removed from the socio-economic order. Rather, its social status and its acceptability was fundamentally linked to its economic worth, or what I, throughout the book, call its pathological value. Now, the real takeaway from the book is that within the psychiatric imaginary, madness was not only a medical or moral category, but it was also an economic form as well. And indeed, I would go so far as to say that its perceived economic value was perhaps the most pressing measure for determining its level of perceived social harm or, conversely, social worth. So in other words, what the book on the whole argues is that madness was essentially economized. In other words, suffused with economic meanings and economic rationalities and imagined through the lens of value, that is, the value that it could conceivably generate or forfeit. And so madness was essentially a condition which was either to be excused or even extolled if it generated some kind of financial benefit, or disavowed if it turned out to be economically detrimental. Now, this book came out of extensive archival research, but it was also sparked by some contemporary issues that I'd been thinking about for some time. In particular, this cultural myth, or maybe it's just a cliche, and one that I think a lot of us are familiar with, that financial enterprisers, or what we also call entrepreneurs, are actually eccentrics whose capacity to innovate rests on some kind of quirk or irrational mentality. And in fact, I devote an entire chapter to the idea of this notion of entrepreneurial madness. It was that idea that really sparked quite a lot of the book, but it ends up only taking up just one chapter. Many of the other chapters talk about a number of other topics, from industrial labor to will writing and other forms of these sort of interesting entwinements of mental illness and economic activity. What I really hope that readers take away from the book is essentially how extensively psychiatry and economic thought have been, in a sense, intertwined, both historically, but also conceptually. How so many of our ideas, not only about mental health, but also about mental illness, are animated and framed by economic norms and economic ideals. In any case, I want to thank you in advance for taking the time to look at this book. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that you derive something from it. I appreciate it.